Lucas had guarded embassies on 3 continents, escorted diplomats who argued about trade routes for 12 straight hours, and once protected a senator who believed every reflective surface might secretly be a sniper. None of those assignments, however, had prepared him for standing inside the royal palace of an alien empire, while gravity politely disagreed with his sense of balance. The palace of Elaris floated above a vast violet ocean that shimmered like liquid glass beneath the night sky. Massive transparent towers curved upward like frozen waves, each one threaded with glowing pathways where silent energy currents moved like rivers of light. Lucas had seen advanced technology before, but the Ilarian capital seemed less like a building and more like a living organism that had decided architecture was a hobby. He stood near the entrance of the royal audience chamber, hands calmly folded behind his back, posture straight in the way security training demanded. His uniform was immaculate. His eyes quietly scanned every corridor and balcony. Professional, alert, focused. Unfortunately, his inner thoughts were far less professional. Do not stare at the floating ceiling. Guards probably aren't supposed to stare at ceilings. The ceiling wasn't helping. It slowly shifted color like a sunrise trapped in slow motion. Lucas looked back at the corridor. That was when he noticed it again. The princess was staring at him. Princess Kael sat beside her mother at the long ceremonial table, where members of the royal council discussed matters that sounded extremely important and extremely complicated. Lucas only caught fragments as he stood guard: trade corridors, stellar treaties, orbital migration routes. Meanwhile, the princess seemed deeply invested in a far more mysterious subject. Lucas. Her eyes were locked on him with the intense curiosity of someone studying a strange new constellation. Lucas remained perfectly still. Professional bodyguards did not react to royal staring, but after several minutes, he began to wonder if perhaps he had accidentally committed a terrible cultural mistake. Did I salute the wrong person earlier? He replayed the morning in his head. He had saluted a royal officer. He had nodded politely at a floating translator drone. He had almost saluted a statue before realizing statues usually didn't blink. Everything seemed normal, yet the princess continued watching him like he had personally invented gravity. Lucas shifted his weight slightly. The floor moved, not dramatically, just enough to remind him that Ilarian architecture occasionally adjusted gravity fields to reduce structural stress. Lucas recovered his balance smoothly. Professional, very professional. Inside his mind, however, another thought appeared. If the floor does that again, I am absolutely pretending it was intentional. Across the chamber, Queen Shira spoke calmly with her advisors. She carried the quiet authority of someone who had ruled for many years, and even from a distance, Lucas could sense the weight of that presence. Like her daughter, she looked mostly human, tall, elegant, pale silver hair flowing down her back. But the long, graceful ears that curved upward from the sides of her head marked her unmistakably as Ilarian. Their species resembled humanity in many ways, except when they didn't, which happened often. Lucas had read the briefing files carefully before arriving. The Ilarian royal family possessed heightened perception abilities tied to something their scientists described as resonance awareness. It involved quantum-level emotional signatures. Lucas had understood roughly 3% of that explanation. For now, his job was simple. Stand still, watch everything, protect the royal family, preferably without falling into any alien furniture. Unfortunately, alien furniture seemed determined to challenge him. A small floating chair drifted gently across the room behind him. Lucas sensed movement and glanced over his shoulder. The chair drifted closer. It rotated slightly, then stopped. Lucas narrowed his eyes. "Don't start," he muttered quietly under his breath. The chair floated away again. Problem solved. When Lucas looked forward again, Princess Kael was still watching him. Now she looked slightly amused. Lucas blinked once. "Great. The princess saw me threaten a chair." Kael tilted her head slightly, her bright eyes studying him in a thoughtful way that didn't feel mocking. If anything, she looked curious, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle that only she could see. Lucas gave a small, polite nod in her direction. Professional courtesy. The princess returned the nod slowly, still watching him with that same focused expression. Across the table, Queen Shira noticed the interaction. She did not interrupt the council discussion, but her eyes briefly shifted toward Lucas, then toward her daughter. Kyle had rarely paid this much attention to anyone outside the royal family, especially not a human guard who had arrived less than a week ago. Shira returned her focus to the council, though a quiet thought had already begun forming in the back of her mind. Something about this was unusual, not alarming, not dangerous, but unusual. And in a palace that had existed for centuries, unusual things were rarely random. Meanwhile, Lucas was trying very hard not to make eye contact with the floating chair again, because it had returned, and this time it looked confident. Lucas had learned many things during his years in security. One of the most important lessons was that when powerful people began asking polite questions, it usually meant something complicated was about to happen. This realization came to him the moment a small hovering drone appeared beside him the next morning. The drone projected a soft blue light and spoke in a calm mechanical voice. "Security Officer Lucas Hale, the Royal Research Council requests your presence." Lucas blinked. "Am I in trouble?" The drone paused for exactly 1 second. "That outcome has not yet been determined." Lucas sighed quietly. That was not the most comforting answer he had ever received. Still, he followed the drone through the palace corridors. The passageways curved gently like streams of silver glass, their surfaces glowing faintly with living circuits that pulsed with energy. Outside the transparent walls, the vast oceans of Elaris shimmered beneath drifting cloud islands. Lucas kept walking, though he occasionally felt the strange sensation that the floor was politely adjusting itself to match his steps. At one point, the corridor tilted slightly upward. Lucas stopped. The corridor stopped. Lucas looked down. "All right," he muttered softly. "I respect the technology, but let's keep gravity mostly normal today." The corridor, thankfully, remained cooperative. Eventually, the drone guided him into a large circular chamber filled with equipment that looked like it belonged in a laboratory designed by someone who had never seen a straight line in their life. Floating rings rotated slowly in midair. Transparent screens displayed flowing alien symbols. Several Elarian scientists stood near a wide platform that glowed faintly with shifting patterns. One of them stepped forward. She was tall, with long copper-colored hair and the same elegant upward curving ears Lucas had noticed in the royal family. "Officer Lucas," she said politely. Lucas gave a respectful nod. "Please tell me this isn't about the chair." The scientists exchanged brief glances. "The chair?" Lucas waved a hand vaguely. "Never mind." The lead scientist gestured toward the glowing platform in the center of the room. "We would like you to stand there for a moment." Lucas looked at the platform. It looked suspiciously like the kind of device that either scanned you or teleported you somewhere unexpected. "How long is a moment?" he asked carefully. "Approximately 2 minutes." Lucas considered that. 2 minutes seemed reasonable. 2 minutes was not enough time to accidentally turn someone into energy. Probably. He stepped onto the platform. Soft rings of light formed around him, slowly rotating from head to toe. The sensation wasn't painful, but it tickled slightly, like standing inside a polite thunderstorm. Lucas tried to remain professional. Unfortunately, the lights passed over his boots and made a cheerful chiming sound. He looked down. "Did I just pass a test?" One of the scientists glanced at the readings. "Yes." "What was the test?" "Your footwear integrity." Lucas nodded thoughtfully. "Well, good to know the boots are doing their job." The scanning continued. Lines of data streamed across the floating displays around the room. At first, the scientists watched calmly, adjusting instruments and making small notes. Then something changed. One of the screens flashed. Another emitted a soft warning tone. The lead scientist leaned forward. "Run that sequence again." The system repeated the scan. The warning tone appeared again. Lucas noticed the sudden tension in the room. "Should I be concerned?" he asked. "No," the scientist replied automatically. Lucas waited. "Yet," she added. Lucas folded his arms slightly. "I appreciate the honesty." The lights around him intensified briefly, scanning deeper layers of biometric information. The displays now showed complex diagrams of energy signatures, neural patterns, and something labeled quantum harmonic resonance. Lucas squinted at the screen. That sounds expensive. One of the younger scientists suddenly inhaled sharply. That can't be correct. The lead researcher stepped closer to the display. Compare it with the archive. Another screen appeared beside the first. Rows of ancient data began scrolling across the projection. The two energy patterns overlapped, matched, not perfectly, but close enough that the system highlighted the comparison in bright gold. Silence filled the chamber. Lucas looked around. Okay, he said slowly. Now I'm curious. The lead scientist turned toward him with an expression that was both fascinated and deeply confused. Officer Lucas, have you ever visited Elaris before this assignment? No. Have you ever encountered Ilarian technology before? Not unless you count the floating chair that keeps trying to start a rivalry with me. None of the scientists laughed. Lucas cleared his throat. Tough crowd. The lead researcher studied the data again. This reading is extremely unusual. Lucas raised an eyebrow. Unusual how? The scientist hesitated. Then she answered quietly. Your quantum resonance signature matches a historical pattern stored in the Royal Archives. Lucas frowned. Is that bad? The scientist looked at him carefully. No, she said slowly. But it is impossible. Lucas rubbed the back of his neck. I feel like that word is being used a lot today. Across the room, the glowing screens continued displaying the overlapping patterns. One belonged to Lucas. The other belonged to someone recorded in the palace archives many years ago. Someone important. Someone who had once stood beside Queen Shira, the former king of Elaris. And somewhere else in the palace, Princess Kael suddenly stopped walking in the garden and looked up toward the research towers with a quiet, knowing expression. As if she had just felt something she couldn't quite explain. Meanwhile, Lucas stepped off the scanning platform. So, he asked, does this mean I passed the test? The lead scientist stared at the data again. Officer Lucas, we are no longer sure what the test was. The Royal Research Tower was usually a quiet place where discoveries were discussed in calm voices and data was examined with careful patience. On that particular afternoon, however, several scientists were staring at a floating screen like it had personally insulted them. Run it again, one of them said. We already ran it 7 times, another replied. Run it 8. The machine obeyed. Across the projection, 2 energy patterns appeared again. One belonged to Lucas Hale, human bodyguard. The other belonged to a long archived resonance imprint recorded years earlier. They aligned. Again. Perfectly within the tolerance range. A younger researcher leaned closer to the display and whispered, This violates 3 laws of quantum emotional physics. The lead scientist sighed. 4. Meanwhile, Lucas sat in a chair nearby, patiently waiting while the experts argued about science that sounded suspiciously like wizardry with better equipment. He crossed his arms and watched them debate. After a moment, he raised his hand. Quick question. No one responded. Lucas raised his hand higher. Hello? One scientist glanced at him. Yes? If this turns out to be something dangerous, I'd really prefer to know before my lunch break. The room went quiet for a moment. The lead researcher turned toward him again. Officer Lucas, nothing about you appears biologically dangerous. Lucas nodded. That's comforting. She paused. However, Lucas closed his eyes briefly. There's always a however. The scientist gestured toward the display. What we are seeing here is something our species calls resonance recognition. Lucas studied the glowing diagrams. I'm going to need the version that doesn't require a doctorate. Another researcher stepped forward and attempted to simplify the explanation. When 2 individuals form an extremely strong emotional bond, their neural and quantum fields synchronize. It leaves behind a resonance pattern. Lucas blinked. So, like emotional fingerprints? The scientists exchanged impressed looks. That is actually a very accurate description, one admitted. Lucas shrugged. I watched documentaries. The researcher pointed to the second pattern on the screen. This resonance signature belonged to the former king of Elaris. Lucas straightened slightly. Queen Shira's husband? Yes. Lucas looked back at the display. And you're saying my Emotional fingerprint looks like his? Not identical, the scientist corrected, but close enough that our systems classify it as a resonance match. Lucas rubbed his chin slowly. That sounds like the universe is making a joke. One of the scientists frowned. The universe does not make jokes. Lucas leaned back in his chair. You've clearly never met gravity. At that exact moment, the floating chair beneath him drifted 2 centimeters sideways. Lucas froze. The scientist watched him. Lucas slowly looked down at the chair. We talked about this. The chair remained still. Lucas looked back up. Anyway, he continued calmly, how exactly does this resonance thing work? The lead researcher brought up another holographic display showing complex branching diagrams. Our species developed the ability to detect resonance patterns thousands of years ago. It helped our ancestors recognize deep connections between individuals. Lucas squinted at the diagram. Connections like family? Sometimes. Friends? Yes. The scientist hesitated before finishing the explanation. And sometimes, soul bonds. Lucas stared at her. I'm sorry, did you just say soul bonds? It is a scientific classification. That sounds suspiciously mystical for science. It is measurable. Lucas leaned forward slightly. And Princess Kael can sense these resonance things? The scientists exchanged another look. Yes, one answered. Children of the royal bloodline often have heightened perception. Lucas exhaled slowly. So let me see if I understand this. He pointed at the display. Your scanners say I have a similar emotional energy pattern to the Queen's late husband. Yes. And the princess might be able to feel that somehow. Yes. Lucas rubbed his forehead. And this is the part where everyone starts assuming I'm secretly the ghost of a space king. The lead scientist quickly shook her head. No, that would be extremely unscientific. Lucas nodded. Good. She paused. However, it does suggest that your quantum signature resonates with his in ways we cannot fully explain. Lucas leaned back again. So the official explanation is cosmic coincidence. That is currently the most responsible theory. Lucas stared at the screen for a long moment. Does the Queen know about this? Silence fell over the room. One of the scientists finally answered. She will. Lucas sighed. Great. He stood up from the chair. The chair drifted slightly again. Lucas pointed at it. Listen, I'm already having a strange day. Don't make this personal. The chair rotated slowly. One of the younger researchers whispered to another scientist. Does the furniture normally respond to human speech? No. Lucas crossed his arms. Fantastic. Even the chairs think I'm suspicious. Across the palace, Queen Shira stood on a balcony overlooking the vast violet ocean. The wind moved gently through her silver hair as she watched distant lightning storms dance across the horizon. Behind her, a royal advisor approached quietly. Your Majesty, Shira did not turn. Yes. The Research Council has completed the initial scan of the human guard. And, the advisor hesitated, the results are unusual. Queen Shira slowly looked back toward the palace towers where the research laboratory stood glowing in the distance. Unusual things rarely happen without reason, and deep in her instincts, something ancient stirred. Meanwhile, in the research chamber, Lucas stretched his shoulders and looked at the scientists. So, he said, what happens now? The lead researcher studied the glowing resonance patterns one more time. Then she answered quietly, Now, we inform the Queen. Lucas had returned to his post outside the royal garden corridor, which was a polite way of saying he had been placed somewhere quiet, while very important people decided what to do with the confusing human, who apparently shared a cosmic emotional signature with a deceased alien king. From a security perspective, the assignment was easy. The garden corridor overlooked one of the most peaceful sections of the palace. Transparent arches curved overhead, letting soft golden sunlight pour inside, while floating clusters of blue flowers drifted slowly through the air like lazy constellations. From a personal perspective, however, Lucas had a problem. The floating chair had followed him. It now hovered near the wall, perfectly still. Lucas glanced at it. The chair did not move. Lucas folded his arms. Listen, he muttered quietly. I respect your dedication, but I'm on duty. The chair rotated 2 degrees. Lucas pointed at it. That's exactly the kind of behavior that creates tension. Before the chair could continue whatever mysterious mission it had chosen, a soft voice spoke behind him. You are speaking to the furniture again. Lucas turned. Princess Kael stood at the entrance of the garden walkway, her silver-blue dress catching the sunlight, while her long ears tilted slightly forward in curiosity. Lucas cleared his throat. In my defense, the furniture started it. Kyle walked closer, watching him with that same thoughtful expression she had worn since the day he arrived. You believe the chair is responsible? I'm not ruling it out. She studied the chair for a moment. The chair floated quietly. Kyle smiled faintly. It appears calm now. Lucas nodded. That's what it wants you to think. The princess laughed softly, and the sound seemed to blend with the gentle hum of the palace energy fields around them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The garden corridor stretched out beside them, filled with drifting plants and glowing water spheres that slowly rotated in the air. Lucas noticed her looking at him again. Not casually, carefully, like someone reading a familiar book written in a language they didn't quite remember. He shifted slightly. Princess, if I may ask something. You may. Have I done something unusual? Kael tilted her head. Besides arguing with royal furniture? Lucas sighed. I'm serious. She stepped closer, studying his face with quiet focus. You feel familiar. Lucas blinked. I've heard that before today. You have? Yes, one of the scientists said something very similar. Kael seemed unsurprised by this. That makes sense. Lucas rubbed the back of his neck. I was hoping you might explain why. The princess looked past him toward the floating gardens for a moment, as if trying to put a complicated feeling into simple words. Our people can sense resonance, she said finally. Lucas nodded slowly. I'm starting to hear that word a lot. It is difficult to describe, she continued. It is not memory. Not exactly. Lucas waited. It feels more like recognizing a melody you heard a long time ago. Lucas thought about that. So when you look at me, I hear the melody, Kyle said quietly. Lucas looked down at his boots. Well, that's concerning. I've never been musical. Kael smiled again, but this time there was something gentler in her expression. You are different from the melody, she said, but the rhythm feels the same. Lucas was silent for a moment. So the universe thinks I remind you of someone? Yes. Lucas hesitated before asking the obvious question. Someone important? Kael didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached out and lightly touched one of the floating blue flowers drifting nearby. The flower slowly rotated in the air, releasing a faint glow. My father, she said quietly. Lucas felt something shift inside his chest. He had read the briefing files. The former king of Elaris had died several years ago during a deep space diplomatic mission. I'm sorry, Lucas said gently. Kael looked back at him. You do not need to be sorry. Lucas gave a small, uncertain smile. I usually apologize when I accidentally remind people of complicated things. The princess studied his expression carefully. You are not him. Good, Lucas replied quickly, because that would raise a lot of paperwork questions. Kyle laughed again, but when the laughter faded, her gaze returned to that thoughtful focus. Still, she said softly, when I look at you, the feeling is there. Lucas scratched his head. Honestly, Princess, I'm still trying to understand how the chairs work here. Behind him, the floating chair drifted slightly closer. Lucas turned immediately. Don't you dare! The chair stopped. Cal covered her mouth to hide another smile. You are very unusual for a royal guard. I get that a lot. They stood quietly in the garden corridor for a moment, watching the slow movement of the floating plants and distant sky beyond the palace walls. Then Kael asked softly, do you believe the universe ever gives second chances? Lucas thought about the question longer than he expected. Finally, he shrugged. I believe the universe does a lot of strange things. Kael looked at him. And second chances? Lucas glanced at the glowing horizon beyond the palace gardens. I think, he said slowly, if the universe goes through the trouble of creating something impossible, It probably has a reason. Kyle smiled quietly. Across the palace, high in the Royal Observatory Tower, Queen Shira stood beside the Research Council as the resonance data floated in front of them. Her eyes moved slowly across the glowing patterns. One belonged to the king she had lost. The other belonged to the human now speaking with her daughter in the garden below. The patterns aligned again, not identical, but close enough that the ancient recognition systems of her species refused to ignore it. Queen Shira looked down through the glass towers toward the distant garden corridor. Far below, she could see Kyle standing beside the human guard, watching him, smiling. And for the first time since the scientists had shown her the results, a quiet thought formed in the queen's mind. Not fear, not suspicion, something far more dangerous, hope. The Royal Observatory Tower stood higher than any other structure in the palace, a place where the Elarian court studied the stars and occasionally the strange behavior of fate itself. Transparent walls curved outward into the sky, revealing endless space beyond the planet's atmosphere. From here, Queen Shira could see the violet oceans of Elaris far below, and the faint glow of orbital stations circling the world like patient guardians. Floating screens surrounded her in quiet circles of light. Symbols, numbers, and flowing energy patterns drifted across them with soft humming sounds. The scientists had withdrawn a respectful distance, leaving the queen alone with the data. Shira studied the resonance patterns again. Two signatures hovered in the air. One belonged to the man she had lost. The other belonged to a human who had once nearly saluted a decorative statue. The universe had an unusual sense of humor. Behind her, the lead researcher cleared her throat carefully. "Your Majesty." Shira did not look away from the projection. "Yes, the scans have been verified 12 times. That seems excessive." The scientist shifted slightly. "We wanted to be certain." Shira finally turned toward her. "And are you certain?" The scientist hesitated before answering. "As certain as science allows." Shira walked slowly around the floating display, her long silver hair moving gently in the tower's artificial breeze. She had ruled an empire for many years. She had faced wars, political betrayals, and cosmic storms that threatened entire colonies. Yet somehow a quiet human bodyguard had become the most confusing phenomenon she had encountered in a decade. "Explain it again," she said. The researcher nodded and activated another display. A layered hologram appeared, showing complex wave patterns folding across one another like ripples in invisible water. "Our species evolved the ability to detect resonance bonds thousands of years ago," the scientist began. Shira crossed her arms slightly. "I am aware of our history." "Yes, of course." The researcher adjusted the display. "These patterns form when two individuals share a deep emotional synchronization. Their neural energy fields align, creating a harmonic imprint in quantum space." Shira sighed softly. "I asked for an explanation, not a poetry recital." The scientist blinked. "Apologies." She simplified the display. Two lines of light appeared. When two people form an extraordinary connection, their energy patterns begin to match. Shira looked at the second line of light. "And you are telling me that the human guard carries a pattern similar to my husband?" "Yes." Shira studied the data again. "Not identical." "No, but close enough that our resonance detection systems react to it." "Yes." Shira walked toward the window and looked down at the palace gardens far below. Tiny figures moved through the distant corridors. One of them was Lucas. Even from this distance, she could recognize the way he stood slightly too straight, like someone trying very hard not to look nervous. She had observed him carefully over the past few days. He did not resemble the former king. The king had moved with the quiet confidence of someone born to command star fleets. Lucas moved like a man cautiously navigating furniture that occasionally floated. Shira allowed herself a small, reluctant smile. Behind her, the scientist continued speaking. "There is another development, Your Majesty." Shira turned back. "I suspected there would be." The researcher activated a new set of readings. These measurements track resonance interaction between Lucas and Princess Kael. Shira's expression sharpened. "And the readings intensify whenever they are within close proximity." Shira looked at the display. The patterns glowed brighter where the two signals overlapped. "Explain." Princess Kael appears to be naturally responding to the resonance pattern. Shira's voice lowered slightly. Responding how? She senses familiarity. Shira looked toward the gardens again. She told me that once, the queen said quietly. The scientist nodded. For members of the royal bloodline, resonance perception can be particularly strong during youth. Shira studied the data. And what exactly does that mean for the human? The researcher hesitated. It means Princess Kael recognizes something in him that reminds her of the former king. Shira remained silent for a long moment. The stars beyond the observatory glass shimmered softly. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the calm authority that had guided her empire through countless crises. This is not reincarnation. No. This is not possession. No. This is not some cosmic trick. We do not believe so. Shira looked back at the display again. Then what is it? The scientist paused before answering. Our best theory is that emotional resonance can echo across time and space. Shira narrowed her eyes slightly. That sounds suspiciously like destiny. The scientist shifted uncomfortably. Scientists try not to use that word. Shira walked slowly back toward the projection. Yet your data suggests something very close to it. Yes. The queen folded her hands behind her back. And the human himself? He appears completely unaware. Shira gave a quiet, thoughtful hum. That part, I believe. She watched the two resonance patterns drift slowly across the display. For years, she had forced herself to accept that the past was gone, that the man she loved existed only in memory. Yet now the universe had placed a strange human guard in her palace, who somehow carried an echo of that bond. Not the same man, not even close, but something familiar. Below the observatory, in the garden corridor, Lucas was currently trying to convince the floating chair to maintain a respectful distance from him. The chair rotated slowly. Lucas pointed at it. I'm serious. Personal space. Far above, Queen Shira watched the garden through the observatory window. Her daughter stood nearby, laughing softly at something Lucas had said. For the first time in years, Kael looked carefree, hopeful. Shira felt something tighten quietly in her chest. The universe was offering a question she had never expected to face. And for a ruler who had built her strength on certainty, questions were always the most dangerous things of all. Lucas had decided that guarding an alien royal family was far less about dramatic combat and far more about trying to behave normally while the laws of physics quietly experimented with new ideas around him. The garden corridor had become his usual post during the afternoons. Sunlight filtered through the transparent dome above, scattering warm gold across the floating ponds and drifting plants. Small spheres of water hovered lazily in the air, rotating like miniature planets while thin streams of glowing particles flowed between them. Lucas had learned one important rule about the palace gardens. Never trust the fish. At first, the fish looked normal enough. Elegant silver creatures that swam through the floating water spheres with graceful, slow movements. Then one of them had blinked at him, not like a fish, more like someone who understood the concept of sarcasm. Lucas pointed at the sphere suspiciously. I know what you did. The fish blinked again. Lucas crossed his arms. Don't think I forgot. Behind him, a familiar voice spoke. You are interrogating the aquatic wildlife again. Lucas turned. Princess Kael stood a few steps away, her long silver-blue robes brushing gently against the glowing grass that lined the garden paths. The light reflected softly across her pale skin and the elegant curve of her long ears. Lucas gestured toward the floating water sphere. That fish knows something. Kyle looked at the fish. The fish swam in a slow circle. It appears peaceful. That's exactly what it wants you to believe. The princess laughed softly. Lucas had noticed that she laughed more often these days. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with quiet ease, like someone rediscovering something simple that had been missing for a long time. Kyle walked beside him and looked out across the gardens. You seem more comfortable here now. Lucas nodded. I've made peace with most of the furniture. At that moment, the floating chair drifted slowly past behind him. Lucas didn't turn around. I saw that. The chair stopped. Kael covered her mouth to hide another laugh. You speak to objects as if they are alive. On this planet that feels like a reasonable precaution, the princess leaned lightly against the railing beside him. For a moment they watched the floating gardens together in silence. Then Kael spoke again. You teach interesting things. Lucas glanced at her. Such as? The game with the stones. Lucas smiled slightly. Earlier that day he had shown her a simple human game using small polished pebbles from the garden path. It involved tossing them into the air and catching them in different patterns. She had mastered it within minutes. Lucas suspected that alien royal education probably included hand-eye coordination lessons, far beyond his own childhood experience. You cheated, he said. I did not. You used faster reflexes. That is not cheating, Lucas shrugged. Human rules. Kael lifted one of the pebbles and tossed it gently into the air, catching it without looking. Then your species has very limiting rules. Lucas laughed quietly. Fair. She studied him again with that thoughtful gaze. Lucas noticed. Am I doing the familiar thing again? Yes. Lucas sighed. I should probably apologize to your father at this point. Kael shook her head softly. You are not him. I'm glad we've confirmed that. But the feeling remains. Lucas leaned back slightly against the railing. Princess, can I ask something honest? You always do. Does it bother you? She seemed surprised. The resonance. Lucas nodded. That I remind you of someone important. Kael looked out across the floating garden pools again. The light of the distant sun reflected across the water spheres like tiny galaxies. It does not make me sad, she said quietly. Lucas waited. It makes me curious. Curious? She turned toward him again. Our people believe resonance echoes appear when the universe wants two paths to cross. Lucas raised an eyebrow. That sounds suspiciously philosophical. It is also scientific. I'm beginning to suspect your scientists enjoy philosophy. Kael smiled faintly. Lucas thought for a moment. So the universe decided our paths should cross? Yes. He scratched his head. That feels like a lot of responsibility for a security contract. Kael laughed again. You worry too much. I'm a bodyguard. Worrying is literally the job. At that moment, the floating chair drifted past again. Lucas pointed immediately. You're doing it on purpose now. The chair rotated slowly. Kael shook her head, still smiling. You are the only guard who argues with palace furniture. Lucas folded his arms. Someone has to set boundaries. Their conversation faded into another comfortable silence. Across the palace towers above them, unseen sensors quietly monitored the resonance patterns again. The readings had grown stronger. Inside the observatory, the scientists watched the data with increasing fascination. One of them spoke softly. The synchronization is stabilizing. Another nodded. And the princess seems calmer. Far above them, Queen Shira stood watching the garden through the observatory glass. She saw Kael speaking with Lucas. She saw the way her daughter's posture had relaxed, the way her laughter came easily now. For years after the king's death, Kael had carried a quiet sadness that no advisor or teacher had been able to ease. Yet now, standing beside a confused human bodyguard who argued with chairs and suspected fish of conspiracy, she looked lighter, hopeful. Shira exhaled slowly. The universe was presenting her with a question she could not ignore. In the garden below, Lucas watched the horizon where the violet ocean met the glowing sky. Princess, he said quietly. Yes? Do you ever feel like the universe is setting up a joke and we're the last ones to understand it? Kael looked at him thoughtfully. Perhaps, Lucas nodded. I'm just hoping the punchline isn't dangerous. Kael smiled. I think the universe prefers surprises. Behind them, the floating chair drifted slightly closer again. Lucas didn't even turn around. I swear, if you bump into me, we're having a serious conversation. The chair froze in place. And for the first time in many years, Princess Kael laughed without any shadow of sadness in her voice. Lucas had spent the morning reviewing palace security protocols, which was a polite way of saying he was trying to understand why one corridor occasionally rotated 90 degrees for aesthetic symmetry. He had decided not to question it. Some mysteries were safer when left alone. He stood in the quiet observation hall overlooking the gardens. the transparent walls revealing the vast sky of Elaris beyond. Starships moved slowly across the upper atmosphere, like distant silver birds. The palace hummed softly with energy, alive with the quiet rhythm of a civilization that had mastered technologies humans could barely explain. Lucas adjusted the collar of his uniform. Something felt different today, not dangerous, just significant. Behind him, the doors of the hall opened with a soft whisper. Lucas turned and immediately straightened. Queen Shira entered the chamber. She moved with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without raising her voice. The light of the observatory windows reflected across her silver hair, and for a moment Lucas understood why entire star systems respected her authority. He bowed his head slightly. "Your Majesty, Officer Lucas." Her voice was steady, but there was curiosity in it as well. Lucas noticed something unusual. She had come alone. No guards, no advisors, just the Queen. Lucas kept his posture respectful. "Is everything secure?" she asked. "Yes, Your Majesty." Shira stepped closer to the window, looking out toward the floating gardens below. Lucas waited. After a moment, she spoke again. "You have adapted quickly to the palace." Lucas considered that. "I've learned to negotiate with the furniture." Shira glanced at him. "The furniture? There is a chair that follows me." Shira studied his face carefully, as if trying to determine whether he was joking. Lucas kept a straight expression. "It's persistent." The Queen looked back toward the gardens again. "Elarian furniture does not normally follow people." Lucas nodded. "That's what makes it suspicious." For a moment, silence filled the chamber. Then, unexpectedly, Queen Shira allowed a small smile. It faded quickly, but Lucas noticed. She turned toward him again. "You know why you are here?" Lucas hesitated. "I've heard several theories." "And what is your theory?" Lucas scratched the side of his neck slightly. "That the universe occasionally makes very strange decisions." Shira studied him carefully. "My people believe in resonance. I've heard. You carry a pattern that echoes someone I lost." Lucas met her gaze respectfully. "I understand that." Shira looked at him for a long moment. "You do not seem frightened by this." Lucas shrugged slightly. "I've spent the last week being scanned by glowing machines and followed by a chair. My definition of frightening has shifted." For the first time, Shira laughed quietly. It was a brief sound, but it carried warmth. Lucas relaxed slightly. The Queen walked slowly toward the center of the chamber. "My daughter believes the universe has given her a second chance to feel a connection she thought was gone." Lucas listened carefully. "She knows you are not her father," Shira continued, "but she senses something familiar in you." Lucas nodded. "She explained it like hearing an old melody." Shira's expression softened. "Yes." Lucas looked out toward the gardens below. "Your Majesty, I don't know why the resonance exists." "I know, but I do know one thing." Shira waited. Lucas spoke calmly. "I care about keeping your daughter safe." The Queen studied his face carefully, not searching for perfection, searching for sincerity. "What changed you?" she asked. Lucas thought about that for a moment. "When I arrived here, this assignment was just a job. And now?" Lucas looked out at the horizon again, where the violet oceans met the sky. "Now I understand something your people already know." "What is that?" "That connections between people matter, even when we don't fully understand them." Shira considered his answer quietly. Then she walked toward the observation window and looked down at the garden paths below. Princess Kael stood there near the floating water pools, watching the sky, waiting. Shira exhaled slowly. For years she had believed the universe had taken something from her that could never be replaced. But the universe had not returned the past. Instead, it had offered something different, something new. She turned back to Lucas. "Walk with me." Lucas followed her to the garden corridor. Kel looked up as they approached. Her eyes brightened slightly when she saw Lucas beside her mother. The Queen watched her daughter for a moment. "You feel it too," Shira said quietly. Kel nodded. "Yes." Shira looked at Lucas one last time. "The resonance does not mean the past has returned." Lucas nodded. "I know. It means the future has opened a door." Lucas glanced behind him. The floating chair had arrived in the corridor again. He sighed. I knew it. Kyle laughed softly. Shira shook her head slightly. You have brought an unusual energy into this palace, Lucas Hale. Lucas gestured toward the chair. I blame him. The chair rotated slightly. Kael stepped closer, smiling. The universe does strange things sometimes. Lucas nodded. Apparently. The three of them stood quietly in the garden while the floating water spheres drifted slowly around them. For the first time since arriving on Elaris, Lucas no longer felt like a visitor in a strange place. He felt like someone who had become part of a story much larger than himself. And above the palace, the stars continued their silent movement across the sky, carrying with them the quiet certainty that sometimes the universe did not repeat the past. Sometimes it simply created a new beginning.